This show is part of the Proclaim Podcast Network, thoughtfully crafted, faithfully told stories that proclaim His name. More at proclaim.fm.
I'm Paul Hastings, and you're listening to Compelled, where we use gripping, immersive storytelling to bring to life Christian testimonies from the kingdom of God, told by the people compelled to live for Him. This summer, we're doing things a little differently than normal. Just a few weeks ago, we celebrated our 100th episode of Compelled, where we recognized the team behind the scenes who brings Compelled to life and remembered some of our favorite stories from the past 7 years. The testimonies that God writes are so different. People from every life circumstance you can imagine, facing every trial under the sun. And yet on Compelled, we remember the great God who writes those stories. He is the author and perfecter and hero of every journey. And it has been our privilege to bring those testimonies to you through audio for the last 7 years. And by the kindness of God, we're going to keep doing that. We're going to continue bringing you 20 brand new testimonies every year, plus 30 remastered episodes from the archives. But now, today, we're looking ahead as we plunge into yet another arena of storytelling, this time through the written word. That's right, as of today, our very first book of Compelled Testimonies has been released. It's full of amazing stories of what God is doing around the world. And the title of our book, you'll never guess it, is Compelled. And with any great book, there is a story behind the stories. And in today's episode, we're going to dive into that. In the first half, you're going to hear the testimony of Jonathan Carswell, the founder of 10ofThose, which is the ministry publishing our book. Jonathan grew up in a Christian home and could have explained the gospel to you forwards and backwards, but it held no actual power in his personal life. But then one day, the scales fell off his eyes, and Jonathan saw Jesus for who He truly was, which put into motion a revolution in the world of Christian publishing. Then, in the second half of today's episode, you'll hear the two of us discuss the Compelled Book specifically and the impact that we pray it'll have on believers and non-believers alike. So gather around, lean in, and join us for this compelling story from the kingdom of God. I met up with Jonathan at his home in Chicago just a few weeks ago. His wife and 2 young boys greeted us, and then we headed upstairs for what was supposed to be a 30-minute interview about our Compelled book. But when we finished 2 hours later, it was obvious that there was way more to Jonathan's personal journey of faith and how it led into book publishing. And Jonathan's story begins in the 1980s as he was growing up in England.
So if you've never been to the UK, it's a really old place. Okay, so some of our buildings are from like the 1200s. They're like a long, long time ago. And a lot of those buildings are religious buildings. So our background, our upbringing as a nation is very Christian. And yet, where we are in the UK spiritually is very, very dark. There aren't many Christians at all. Where I grew up, it's a place called Leeds. It's a city of about 800,000. 1 in 1,000 people attend church, and that is anything from, Protestant, Catholic, anything. That is the same ratio as people who attend church in Japan. There's an odd mix of history in that schools still need 20 minutes of religion every week. So they'll often do that in a school assembly or a religious education class. But it's taught by people who haven't got a clue and are not interested but have to do it. And religion, well, what could that be? Well, that's as many religions as you want, as you can teach in that time. So you're getting Christianity mixed up with Hinduism, with Islam, with Roman Catholicism. And the teacher hasn't got a clue between the difference between them, but they've got to teach them. Well, you think what kids turn out as when they're being taught that. It's a real mess. And there's this Bible ignorance that people don't have a clue. And that is the backdrop of the UK. And so, when somebody comes to faith, it's like, well, it's a miracle wherever it happens, but it seems a huge miracle in the UK. In America, I would say there's a lot of churchianity. So people who, they'll go to the tennis club on a Tuesday, maybe it's pickleball on a Friday, and it's church on Sunday. You don't really get that in the UK. You don't even get the people who go at Christmas and Easter. I grew up in a Christian family. I'm the youngest of 4, which means I am spoiled and bullied in equal measure. And my dad was an itinerant evangelist. And so he would spend around 10 months of the year not at home. He would be traveling mainly in Europe, sometimes over in the States, but predominantly even in the UK. And so he would go away for 2-3 weeks at a time, and he would go to a church who would run an evangelistic mission, or maybe a university who would run a sort of 7-day evangelistic work. And he might go to 1 or 2 or 3 back to back, and then come home. He might be home for 3-4 days, and it'd be a whirlwind, and then he'd go off on his next trip. And they also live by faith. So that also created its own sort of interest in that he never asked for money, never sort of set a fee. It was just what people would either send in as gifts or what the host church would give. But he would often go to universities where, they would give him a box of chocolates at the end of sort of a 10-day mission. And that was his expenses and payment. Well, that doesn't fill your car with fuel, and it doesn't fill the fridge either. But he's a diabetic, so it didn't even feed him. So there were definite challenges with living by faith. But it was also the introduction for me of, well, what is it to follow Jesus? Try and get a mortgage when you live by faith. Explain that to the bank manager. They just don't understand it. And yet, we never missed a meal. We never didn't pay a bill. I remember one occasion very vividly. It was my mum, my sister, and myself, because my older siblings had left home at that point. And she gave us dinner, and she said, "That's the last food in the fridge." And yeah, we still never missed a meal. I can't remember how the Lord provided, but yeah, the fridge and freezer filled back up. But I remember vividly that. Or another occasion where a bill came in, I think it was an electricity bill, and we didn't have the money to pay it. But the very day that arrived, a check arrived for exactly the same amount, to the penny. It was amazing. And so there's loads of stories of that, which helped me as I saw the Christian faith being taught. I saw it being lived out as well.
But just because Jonathan had heard the good news of Jesus preached and had seen the gospel lived out, it didn't mean that he embraced it for himself. In fact, just the opposite. Jonathan was resistant to letting the gospel be personal to him.
I had heard my dad speak many times, because there were times where we were able to go either because he was local, or we would go away in the summer, for example. We'd miss 2 weeks of school and go to Eastern Europe while it was a communist era. We would take some Bibles and hide them, and we'd go as a family. We'd go to the sort of eastern part of Poland and through Czechoslovakia, and as it was then, and Hungary, and East and West Germany. We'd do this as a family. And it meant I heard the gospel time in and time out, really. And it wasn't real for me. And then at age 15, I went on a sports camp to Holland. It was great. Loads of sport and cycling in Holland, because everywhere's flat. So you can do sort of 30 miles a day and you don't even feel it. But it was a Christian camp. So in the morning, there was a Bible talk. And then in the evening, there was what would be more sort of a gospel talk. And, I listened like I always would have done. I knew what they were going to say because I'd heard it all before. And then on that camp when I was 15, one of the leaders said, "Well, Jonathan, would you give your testimony tonight?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." I wasn't a Christian, but they didn't know that, because I was living as a Christian, I guess, when I was at home or in the school breaks. But at school, I was just living life for myself. And I gave my testimony. Nobody would have known any different. but it was all just words. It didn't mean anything. It just meant nothing to me personally and didn't impact my life at all. In fact, when I was at school, I went out of my way to live not as a Christian because they knew that my dad, in their eyes, was a vicar, a minister, and that is just the uncoolest thing that you can have at school. And so as a 15-year-old lad who's just trying to be cool, just trying to fit in, you want to do anything that does that, really. And so little things like we grew up without a television at home. And so when you came in at school and they were talking about what they'd seen on TV, I'd just make up programs and say, oh, did you see this on that channel? They were like, no, never even heard of it. I was like, oh, it was great. And it was all just a lie because I was desperate to fit in. But what was going on in my life was turmoil, really. I knew the wrong in my own life. Relationships was a big thing. I was never a big drinker or, my friends were taking drugs. I was at a boarding school, though I didn't board. I was a day pupil, but they had disposable income and, they were up to all sorts. But I wasn't so much that, but I was doing everything that I could to fit in. And it was just, my life was just a sticky mess in that sense of like, I desperately wanted to be clean and I couldn't do it. And the harder I tried, the more I just got into a greater and greater mess. And during that year, I began to, what I would now describe is depression, really. A sort of darkness, a cloud, what I think Winston Churchill described as a black dog. I knew that personally. And anyway, at the end of that year, I had split up with my girlfriend of that time, which is often what I would do at the end of the school year. And because I'd then go have my summer vacation and we'd get back together again. And it was, like I say, it was a mess. But I went on that same sports camp to Holland. And I can't tell you what it was other than a deep work of God by his Spirit that one of the guys who I'd heard speak many, many times spoke again one of those evenings. And it was on that camp that I trusted the Lord. I knew in my head and my heart this time for the first time that I needed just to totally surrender my life. A friend of mine once described it as crossing the eye of your life out. And on that Friday night, that's what I did. I crossed the eye of myself out of my life and said that I need to be under new management and ask God for forgiveness and to change me. And I have to say that is the best decision I've ever made. But being a Christian has been the hardest thing ever, but it's always been good.
Jonathan began to lose friends over his decision to follow Christ. He no longer laughed at the same jokes or felt comfortable about some of their old conversation topics. But Jonathan knew that following Christ was an all-or-nothing decision and that there was no middle road. And accordingly, that was going to affect not only what friends he had, but also what he chose to pursue as a career.
I grew up in a city, but I really wanted to be a farmer. So in my vacation time, I would go off and help on a farm. I'm not sure I was any help to them whatsoever, but I enjoyed it, just being outside. But becoming a Christian meant, okay, maybe I don't want to be a farmer, but I want to be involved in sharing the good news with others. And so I then began to look at, well, what should I do for university? So age 16, I become a Christian, 2 years of further education, and then off to university. Well, I wasn't academic. I didn't really like that sort of stuff. So I began going through a list of every degree that was offered in the UK. And it was this big old book of like 1,500 pages. And I got to why, and I'd gone through everything. I was like, there is nothing I want to do here. And then I got to why, and it was youth and children's work, and then with an open parenthesis, church-based specialism, close parenthesis. It's like, that's interesting. I'd quite like to do that. And it was a pretty good university in the UK, a place called Durham. And the grades I needed, I was like, oh, I'm not going to get those. But anyway, I kind of went for it. I applied. And sure enough, I didn't get the grades I needed to, but they accepted me anyway. and went off to Durham and studied. And about halfway through my first semester, my tutor called me in and he said, Jonathan, what grades did you get at what's called A-levels in the UK? And I told him, he was like, yeah, that's what I've got written here. We should never have accepted you. Keep your head down, work hard, and I won't tell anyone. And so that's why, well, I'm not sure I did keep my head down, but I tried to work hard as best I could. Yeah, I did a 3-year degree in youth and children's work with a church-based specialism.
In 2005, Jonathan became a youth pastor for a congregation in Northern Ireland, and over the course of 3 years, helped the church grow their outreach program from 35 teenagers every week, most of whom already attended the church with their families, to 150 teens, most of whom had very limited exposure to the church or the gospel. And on more than one occasion, Jonathan realized that as he tried to challenge the teenagers in his youth group to take their spiritual walk seriously, his own faith was being stretched in ways that, at times, was uncomfortable.
When I was a youth pastor, I'd go and speak at other churches, and I'd try and take 4 or 5 guys with me, just so we could spend some time together and sort of mentor, and they could, this whole sort of watch my life type thing. And I'd gone and we'd done a session on sharing the gospel. It was about evangelism. And one of the things I challenged people to do was talk to those that they engaged with. And I threw out an idea. I was like, it's a dumb idea because they weren't even drivers at the time, but they weren't of that age. And I was like, so like when you're filling up with gas, you could talk to the person in the gas station and whatever, and you could give them a gospel tract, whatever. There was some idea like that. Anyway, on the way back, I needed gas, and so I had to stop. And I was like, oh no, they're going to say something. And sure enough, the guys in the back were like, so you're going to tell them about Jesus like you told us to? I was like, well, I'm going to have to now. I was like, yeah, of course I am. Anyway, so I filled it with gas. In the UK, you pay after you've filled up. You don't pay for before you go because, I don't know, we're more trusting or whatever. So I was walking from the gas pump to the shop inside, and I was like, God, please help me, because I'm going to look awful to these young people. But such a terrible prayer. It was all about how I looked. But I was like, please, will you help me? Got there and I was kind of fiddling around with a gospel tract in my pocket thinking, how do I do this? And it's so awkward and I feel terrible. And the guy, the cashier said, do you have a club card point, or like rewards point thing? And I was like, oh, no, I don't. And I was like, how can I get that onto the gospel? I was like, oh, can't think of anything. This is what he said. He said, don't worry, it's not a sin. And if it was a sin, we'd have a vicar on hand for you. Well, it was an open goal for me. I was like, do you know what? I don't need a vicar. And I was then able to kind of say something about the Lord Jesus and what have you, and fumble the gospel tract in front. And I was like, and I went back to the car, and again, my motives were terrible. I was like, good, I can tell the young people I was able to share the gospel. But it's funny, that story has always stuck with me, not because of the way I did it, whatever. But if you pray for opportunities, God will always open up a door. At the back end of my first year, and I did 3 years, I thought I needed a hobby. I played soccer on a Saturday morning. But then what did I do? I was a single guy. I'd done a little bit of selling. I had got this kind of business cracking eggs that I'd done when I was younger. I'd sold programs at Soccer Stadium at Leeds United. I really enjoyed that. I got a season ticket to go in and watch them, but I also got money from selling, and I just loved that. So I enjoyed selling. I enjoyed that sort of trying to turn a profit from something. But I wanted to do something that had some eternal value. My dad had written some books. My sister worked in publishing. And so I thought, hey, what I could do is I could bring in some books that I would like our young people to be reading. And maybe if I bought them in bulk, I could get the price lower. And maybe there are other churches that might like to get them at this low price. But that would also be good because it would impact the sales charts. And they would see, oh, it's this author or it's this sort of genre that's selling well. And maybe it would have a positive impact on the book selling world and the publishing world where, there are a lot of books published and not all of them are great. And so that's what I thought I'd do. So I bought three titles. I bought 1,000 copies of each: True Worship, Turning Points, and Distinctives. And they were all by the same author, a guy called Vaughan Roberts. He's written a much better known book now called God's Big Picture, but that was him. Yeah, I bought all the copies I could for what was 99p, so about $1.25. On that first one, I contacted what was the equivalent of Lifeway. It was called Wesley Owen, and they had a load of stores. It's such a similar story to Lifeway. It's uncanny. But they were beginning to hit hard times. And so actually I rang them up and said, how many of these 3 books have you got? And they said, well, we can't tell you. So I said, okay, well, I'll buy 3,000 of each. And they said, oh, well, we don't have that many. I said, well, I'll buy as many as you've got. And that's how I found out how many they'd got. They were actually selling them on their website for that low price. And so I just bought them at that price. But because I'd cleared the lot, nobody else could get that price. And I just knew I'd have to sell all of them by the end of the month because that's when Amex were going to need their payment. And so I sold them in 10s and I sold them for about $2.75 each, but you had to buy 10. So $27.50 and I'd pay your delivery. So I just emailed anybody I could think of, friends, people I'd been to college with, churches, anybody. And Amazon kind of, I think this was about 2006 perhaps. Amazon wasn't really a thing. And bulk buying, nobody did it. And so it was totally new. And they all went in a week. So I knew I could pay my credit card at the end of the month. But then people would say, oh, well, could you get his other book or another book by a different person, but by a different publisher? And so it began to grow that during the week, I would kind of cook some deals, email people out. And then on Saturday, the products had arrived and I'd go down to the post office and ship them all out. But then to cook a deal with the next one, it was just a case of sending an email to the publisher and say, hey, look, I buy 1,000 at a time, but I want a really good deal. I'd often get sort of 90% of that sort of time. They became wise to my ideas, but nobody was buying 1,000 of anything like that. People were still selling at the retail price. Discounts were not common. And so, yeah, if you're a business and somebody rings up and says, I want 1,000 of something and you've never heard of them, if they're going to pay you up front, sure, I'll make the deal. So I would then get pallets of books delivered to the church. But I knew by the end of the month, they all had to go because Amex would send a statement. And I was making very little money on it, really. It was just a side hobby. I'd get them delivered to the church during the day. I'd load up my car and I'd make multiple trips back to my little sort of apartments. And again, yeah, I had to turn it really quickly because there wasn't very much room. In the end, I then got a little bit of storage room from somebody at the church who said, look, you can have it it was a really low amount of money a month. It was doing everything budget, really budget. We didn't even have a website. It was all just emails and spreadsheets and things. And then eventually we got our website and we're called 10ofthose.com because when we started, people would say, I want 10 of those and 10 of those and 10 of those because we sold in 10s. You couldn't buy a single product like that. You only could buy 10s. And so the name stuck. But the pastor of the church kind of in about my 3rd year said, you're going to have to decide what you're going to do because you can't keep getting skids of books sent to the church. Because I was getting 2 or 3 a week at this point. And so then I had to make that decision of what I was going to do. And I did. I said, look, I'm going to leave and do this full time. In the end, I left a little bit earlier. I left in the May. I was due to leave in the June. I left earlier. I went back to the UK, the mainland. So I went to England and began this work of 10 of those. I couldn't pay myself for about 12 months. I couldn't afford the internet, which is a real challenge when you're an internet sort of company. But I would go and sit in my car in the parking lot of McDonald's because they offered free Wi-Fi. And I had to re-log in every 45 minutes because they only allowed you 45 minutes. But that saved me $100 a year by using their Wi-Fi. Just little things like that. I was really thrifty. I tried to save as much money as I could. Family said that they'll give me enough money basically to pay my rent and feed myself for that period. And yet through their support, I was able to do it. And then Wesley Owen, who were that company equivalent sort of to Lifeway, they closed their stores and withdrew from providing the bookstore for major events. And major in the UK, like the biggest pastors' conference at the time was like 400 people. And that's all the pastors, So nothing big, but that organization said, well, would you come and provide the bookstore for us? And that was the beginning of the work that we did. And this was small fry. We were perhaps doing, 100,000 books a year. It was tiny, but that was the beginning of what we did. And so we moved. You didn't have to only buy 10. You could buy just one, but the more you bought, the bigger the discount, these sorts of things. And then in my personal life, there were some major challenges. I struggled with depression really from the age of 15, and that had carried on right the way through university. I was on antidepressants and really in a very, very dark place. And what I was taking was having no positive impact on me. And the doctor said, you really should now come off these, but it's going to take you 9 months to come off. And I just wasn't prepared to do that. And so having been on it from the age of 15 to now, 23, I just came off them cold turkey, which was terrible, really. I was very sick. It was an awful 2 weeks. But at the end of those 2 weeks, I spoke to a friend and I said, I'm just really, really struggling and I don't know what to do. And they sent me a sermon by Tim Keller called Blessed Self-Forgetfulness. And I was going down to a conference, which was the length of Britain. So it's a kind of 5-hour drive. It was the full length of Britain. And I listened to it 4 times on my way there. And I listened to it 4 times on my way home, this sermon. And it just totally changed my Christian life. But I say all that because I then sent a random email to Redeemer, where Tim Keller was the minister. And I said, I've heard this sermon called Blessed Self-Forgetfulness. It's changed my life. I'd love to publish it. And they wrote back and said, yeah, that's no problem. You can do it. And it was a book then we published. So that was the beginning of our publishing that is called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. It's sold nearly 1 million copies now. But that was the start of a much bigger work, which then saw 10 of those and 10 Publishing begin to sell into America and overseas.
That was 13 years ago when Jonathan's burgeoning company published their very first book. It was only 48 pages, but its impact over the last decade has been tremendous. But we're getting ahead of the story because in those early days, it was still unknown whether or not 10 of those was going to survive.
It was always touch and go. And it was pretty much me and my car and a storage, which was not much more than a big garage, really. But then, we began to hire. So I was living with a guy called Nick, who was a great guy. He actually was a farmer and was looking for agricultural jobs, couldn't get anything. And I was just at that stage where I could probably employ him. And if I employed him and he paid rent to me, that means I could probably just earn a little bit less anyway. And so that all worked. And it was funny, we were 2 lads living in a house and a big garage in that house where the work was. And we would kind of work really hard in the morning. He had a girlfriend, I didn't. So he would then in the afternoon or evening go off with his girlfriend and do whatever. And then I would go back to work. It was a sort of typical lad's house. But at this point, we did have internet. We'd kind of got to that stage of no longer did we have to do that. But we'd do all sorts of things. We'd go and pick up like free magazines from the supermarket. They give these sort of lifestyle magazines. And we'd then shred it, because then that was our packaging. We didn't need to have any packaging. We were just after anything like that. And we were disrupting the market a little bit, to be honest. Nobody was doing bulk. Nobody was doing discount. And then we started doing our own publishing. Well, that really disrupted. There was one particular publisher that people would know, and they really didn't like us. Their CEO and their head of sales came to see us one day, and they came to our house and, you've experienced this today. And it was a mess. It was 2 lads living there, and they must have thought, what on earth is going on? And he looked me in the eye and he said, we are going to do absolutely everything we can to put you out of business. And I knew at that time, it's like, okay, this is this is all or nothing kind of. But again, the Lord provided. We worked hard to be thrifty. We reused our boxes. We got packaging from that sort of thing. I would cut deals and really do all we can to get the prices low. But our heart wasn't to disrupt in an unhealthy way. Our heart was, people need to hear about the Lord Jesus. And how can we help that happen in a bigger way than what's currently doing? Because it felt like there was a bit of a Christian mafia that worked in a certain way, and maybe it needed breaking up a little bit. So yeah, that was fairly hostile. And ironically, as it happens, they actually went bankrupt and they had to be taken over. So yeah, there were definitely interesting early days, but eventually we began to kind of move into a warehouse. But just everywhere we went, there was like this weird sort of situation. So in the house that we rented, the landlord was in prison. And so the police would come round to us and see us often and like find out what was going on. In the end, we got evicted because he hadn't paid his mortgage because he was in prison, and it was all just a mess. But then the new warehouse that we went to, in the end, the police came to visit that because the previous tenants had been growing cannabis. It was just this story of kind of like weird destruction and kind of, but an odd sort of situation of the past had been messy and sinful and criminal. And then we were moving into these places and bringing the gospel. And that was kind of what we were trying to do. Like, all of us are totally messed up and need a savior. And it was almost like in the warehouses, they were being transformed by this Christian company coming in. And we were seeking to be light and salt as with the resources that we got out. But we grew a team, and it was always a little hand to mouth. Growing up in a family that lived by faith, selling stuff was better than we'd ever had it. At least there was money coming in. But it was always fairly tight, but the Lord amazingly provided.
And that's Jonathan's testimony of what God did. How he took a young 16-year-old kid who confessed his sins to the Lord and placed him under new management. It's been 18 years since Jonathan first started 10 of Those as a hobby. But today, they have 70 employees spread across the globe with warehouses in the United Kingdom, America, and Canada. And last year, they sold 3 million hand-selected books that were specifically curated to help readers find a deeper love for Jesus. And today, 10 of Those has published over 400 books of their own and continues to release around 30 new titles each year. And of course, Compelled is their newest book, which brings us to the second half of this episode. During the first half, Jonathan shared his testimony of how he became a believer and then eventually how that led to the creation of 10 of Those. But now you'll hear Jonathan and me share how exactly the Compelled book came about and our vision and hope for how it will be used for the kingdom. So a year ago, I was driving in the car somewhere, and my custom is I listen to podcasts all the time. I rarely listen to the same podcast in a row, though. I've probably sampled 1,000 podcasts in the last 5 years, right? So I'm just constantly sampling. And I've got over 1,000 episodes that are in my queue that I'm supposed to listen to. But by the time so it just kind of everything gets buried, and who knows what I'm going to end up listening to next. And on the top of the list was this interview with this guy, Jonathan Carswell from 10 of Those, which I was familiar with 10 of Those because I'd been to the Gospel Coalition Conference in 2023, seeing you on stage. Oh, okay, cool. I'll listen to the podcast about books and stuff. Sure. And so I listened to the thing. And at the time, I knew that, like, you know what? I'm about to head out to this homeschool graduation that I'm supposed to speak at. There's going to be, I think, 250 kids, graduates that are there. And I'm supposed to think of something to share with these kids. And I thought to myself, well, there was this book that was really influential in my life called Just Do Something by Kevin DeYoung.
Yep.
And it's a custom of mine to just have extra copies around that I can give to young kids that I meet. And in fact, I just gave away some copies last week, actually. So whenever I see those books on sale, I try to stock up. And earlier in the year, 10 of Those had a sale on those very same books. I'd stocked up and I'd given them all away. I was totally out of inventory. And I thought, well, I want to go to this, homeschool conference. I want to talk about this thing. And hey, any kid who wants to come up and talk with me, I'd like to give them a copy. And so I thought, well, I'd like to buy 30 copies, but oh man, 10 of those isn't doing that sale anymore. And I don't want to buy these, I'm a podcaster.
Yeah,
I don't got tons of money laying around. So I pull up my computer, I type in an email to you and say, hey, Jonathan, you don't know me, but I would like to, buy a bunch of these books on discount. Can you offer me the same sale that you did previously? And so that's the email that I sent off. And then I turn to my wife and I say, hey, you wouldn't believe it. I just shot an email to asking if I get the discount on the books and stuff like that. And I forget which of us made a remark, but one of us said, hey, what would be really funny is if we did a book with them someday. Wouldn't that be crazy? Yeah, I know, that'd be crazy. And then we went to bed. So pick it up.
So actually, I need to pick it up before you even email me, because I don't really listen to podcasts, but I do love stories. And so, biographies, autobiographies, that's the sort of thing I like to read. And so my wife had sent me your podcast before you even wrote to me. And I'd listened to a couple, and, because I don't listen to podcasts, that was kind of the end of it. But stuck there, and my memory's not great. I mean, my wife will tell you that. She has to remind me kind of her birthday and etc. Her name. No, not quite that bad. But so I had listened to your podcast, and then because my memory's bad, when you had emailed, I was like, I hadn't made the connection until your footer has the Compelled logo, and I saw it again, and then the penny dropped. I was like, oh, I've listened to this guy before. So anyway, that kind of is the background for me connecting. Then you sent that email, and it was then that sort of idea of, well, this guy has amazing stories, and we do print rather than audio. Is there a way that we could bring those two together? And the backdrop for me for that was 10 of Those in the UK had published a series of books that were collection of stories from different people in different walks of life. So we had one that was called like Real Lives, and it was the story of a car thief and a budgie trader, and there was a journalist and a whole mix of people. And that was one. And then we'd done one that was called Sagas, which is the stories of people who came to Christ over the age of 50. Because in the UK, there's something called sagas, which is holidays for those of retirement age. But saga obviously is another meaning of kind of story. And so, so in that book are people like Colonel Sanders, the KFC guy who was converted, I think, at the age of 83. But again, collection of stories. But the purpose of our publishing these stories was, again, so that people might see, almost watch through their reading, the lives of these people and how they came to faith. And that it might stir in them a sort of inquisitive, God can really change lives. And for Christians to use the books evangelistically, giving it to a neighbor or a friend or a colleague or a family member. And we sought to put these out at low cost and get them out in a big way. So that was the backdrop to then our conversation, which I think followed. I think I probably tried to sell you a few more books and introduce you to a few other bits and pieces that we did.
And I was a hook, line, and sinker. You said, hey, my dad has written this book. We can sell it to you even cheaper. Will you buy like 100 of these or 200? I was like, yeah, I'll do that. That sounds great. I think I bought like 200 copies.
Yeah. And then I think, did I then say to you, hey, have you ever thought about writing up some of the stories that you have on your podcast?
And I remember just like, what? That's the conversation my wife and I just had.
You've been listening to our conversations?
Yeah, I know.
As you say in the introduction, Jesus uses stories all the time to teach and to show people his message and the truth of the gospel. And I think we can do that individually all the time. We've said multiple times, just the way that we live out in front of other people is sharing our story. But there's a common denominator with stories, I think, and it's this: everyone loves it. Whether you're listening on a podcast, reading on a book, what is the common denominator? It's just story. And everybody has a story, and everybody likes a story. And that's why I think when it comes to the gospel and the good news, using story is just a fantastic medium because you can present truth in a way that people understand, in a way that people enjoy, in a way that people can even project themselves into the story of. Well, you've talked, Jonathan, about your depression. Well, I've experienced that. Or you've talked about this or that. And yeah, I understand that. I appreciate what that's like. And now you're telling me about the person who can step into that darkness, or you're talking about that person who's come to do, you're talking about Jesus. And it's a great way to present the truth of Christ through story. Now, not all stories are equal. There are some that are just, oh, wow, that's a humdinger. And, not everybody has the story of depression, or a common denominator is into each of those, Jesus can totally transform, because each of those people need a savior, whether it is through tough times, through wealth, through success, through education, through art. All of them need Jesus. And then so to tell stories of each of those different situations that comes with this common thread is really powerful. And there's long form stories, there's short form stories. I really like books like Compelled that have multiple chapters where you get enough into their story, but it's also not this long tome that you're like, will I ever get to see how this finishes? But also the variety. There's just great variety. And some you can relate to, some you can say, wow, that has never been my situation, but I've been given a glimpse. It's like a little window into their life. And with all this color, it's great to see.
So I just got copies of the book earlier last week.
Yeah.
So 1,000 showed up at my house the other day.
Yeah.
And of course, the mailman's like, what in the world's going on here?
Did he get one? You should have given him
No,
one.
he didn't. He dropped them all off. I'm sure he was like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
But next time I find him. But, I gave some of these copies. I gave some copies away this week, actually. I made a brand new friend at a recent podcast conference I was at this week. And this guy is a Christian, but he has worked for many years at different secular podcast companies.
Right.
And he texted me probably a couple hours before you and I had this interview right now. He texted me from the airport just saying, hey man, I just finished reading chapter 1, which is about Hannah Overton, a mom who is falsely accused of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He texted me and he said, bro, I'm in tears. This was really good. This is a guy who's excelled in the Wall Street world of secular podcast media where they make stuff that's really, really good.
Yeah.
And it was just it was really cool. And again, it's not like, oh, because Sarah and I are such great writers. No, it's because God has written a crazy story of redemption and forgiveness.
Yeah. It is amazing. That is funny because that's the second person this week who's told me that they've cried as they've read it. My vision is that this could go into the hands of many, many people who perhaps would never come to church or maybe not even ask questions. But again, because story is that common denominator, they love a story. I mentioned earlier these books of collection of testimonies and whatever. We know of a story of a man who picked one of these up at a thrift store and read it and was converted. Now, the reason why I think it's amazing that he was converted. But clearly somebody was like, oh, I'm done with this. Like whether they read it in the first place or not, I don't know. But it ended up, but God can still use it even in a thrift store. I have a friend we've been spending some time recently and not a Christian, but got into a conversation with him over these last few weeks where he's really beginning to ask some serious questions. And it was amazing. Yesterday, I was able to give him a Bible. He hasn't owned one since his college days and has certainly never read it. But it's that sort of person. I'm going to give him this as a gift and say, hey, look, just read one of these stories, see what you think. And because for him, I wanted him to understand exactly what you've just said. This is how God writes himself into people's lives and totally changes them, even in the midst of whether it be prison, like that first one was, or in the office or at home, or just totally transforming. And that's exactly what he can do to you. And giving them that opportunity to see, change can come. And I know, this friend, he's desperate for change. He knows he's made some big mistakes. And reading a book like this might just help him see change can come not from turning over a new leaf or a fresh start or a different way, but a total new ownership. It's under new, your life is under new management. I think what I like about this book is It's super accessible. So hang on, how many pages is it? It's 130 pages. It's nice big font. It's easy to read. It's story. It's not preaching to people, but it is clearly showing what the Christian life is all about. They can dip in whatever chapter they want. If they want to dip into chapter 4 about the miracle at the Pentagon, go for it. Start there. But if the one that kind of really catches their eye is, I mean, for me, perhaps the most powerful was Laura's transgendered to transformed. They can dip in wherever they like and see how God changes lives. I would encourage people, like you said at the start of this question, almost don't think of yourself. Think of the 6 or 8 other people that you could give this to and see what God can do when you begin to scatter seeds, because it is amazing where shoots shoot up from and what fruit that can bring. I'll go back to my friend that I've been talking with who, we've been friends for a number of years and never had any real conversation. And yet just out of the blue, we were praying at house group that he might ask me a question. And the very next day he said, "Can I ask you a question? If you were going to investigate Christianity, where would you start?" It was so out of the blue and bizarre. It could only be that God kind of planted that and used it. And I think God's doing that all the time in places that we perhaps haven't even realized. But if we're ready and prepared, we've got some by the front door, or we have them in our purse or in our glove box of our car, there's amazing opportunities to give these out to people.
Absolutely. Let's talk for a minute here about so the vision for this book. This book is 7 stories, great stories that came from the podcast. And I know for a lot of our listeners, there might be this thought process of like, well, why should I get a copy of the book? Because, I already listened to the podcast is free. I already get here. And so cast for us a vision here for a second. Because when I think about this book, it's not like, oh, everyone should go buy a copy for themselves.
Yeah.
I perceive this book as like, everyone should go buy a copy of this for other people. And we've really tried to, like, at least for Sarah and I, we've really been trying to think through hey, how could we actually make this accessible from a cost perspective?
Yeah.
I've been super overt with people telling hey, Sarah and I, we actually don't make any money from the book. There are no royalties we get. I'm not being paid to write this book. In fact, there was a payment which we used to pay our co-author to help us write the book. But Sarah and I are not seeing a single dime from any of these. We got some free books. That's helpful.
Yeah.
But cast us the vision. Why are we so passionate about this book?
Yeah. When your life has been changed by Jesus, you want other people to know about it. And I don't know about you, but there's times where the words fail me. I'll give you an example. All right. So our son is playing in lacrosse under 8s or whatever. And their games are on Sunday morning sometimes. And we just have a family kind of principle of we go to church on a Sunday morning. And that's not what saves us, but because we're trusting in Jesus, we go to church on a Sunday morning. And that's our priority. And there's one of the dads there, he's kind of loud and a bit intimidating. And they'd got through and they're basically through to the state now. And it's like the game is on Sunday. And I'm like, Billy's not going to be able to make it, I'm afraid. And he's like, oh, why not? And I said, oh, well, we're Christians. We go to church on Sunday. He just very quickly and quite aggressively said, well, there's mass on Saturday. Just go then. And I was totally stumped. I didn't know what to say. I thought of a great answer, but it was the following Thursday. And I didn't know what to say. And I felt a fool and it's like a missed opportunity. And there are times where I don't quite know what to say. And we say it and we're like, oh, that was so muddled. I was probably better not saying anything. And that's where I think this is a bit like a tool. It perhaps opens up the door of conversation. I was listening to this podcast. It's my favorite podcast and I've listened to it for a while. They brought a book out and I got it. And actually, I think you might enjoy it. And so I got you a copy. So that's unlocking the door of conversation by using this tool. Maybe you're much better equipped and a lot more evangelistic than I am. And you've been talking with your friend or colleague and you've had good conversations about what you believe. And maybe they perhaps shared what they believe. And a resource like this can help further that conversation. Hey, Fred, you were talking about this and you were talking about justice and will we ever see justice? I've been reading this book called Compelled and, chapter 1 is about the story of so-and-so, and they, there's this total miscarriage of justice. I think you might enjoy it. And so a resource like this can further the conversation. There are times, though, where perhaps you've had a conversation and, that's coming to the end of it. It's a quick moment. The Domino's pizza man brings the delivery. Or you're chatting with somebody on your vacation in your hotel, and you'll never see them again. You live in a different part of the world, and you're only friends kind of fairly superficially, but you hung out a couple of times over vacation. Well, this may be the last opportunity that you have to talk with them. And a book like this can do that. So I think, here's the vision. A book like this can engage people well because it's well written, it's great stories, it's nicely produced, all these sorts of things, to unlock the door of conversation, to continue the conversation, or maybe to close the conversation.
I only have these copies that just showed up. But before that, I got 20 other copies in the mail that y'all airmailed to me past the Trump tariffs or whatever.
Yeah.
And I got
that TSA agent.
Past the TSA agent, yeah. And I got these airmail. And so these 20 copies, we began giving out to different friends that we had and people who had worked on the book and things. And one of the copies, I went to go, we're in the process of buying a new house.
Right.
And we had a mold inspector come to the home. And when he was done, he did a very thorough inspection. We, kind of cultivated this friendship over the course of 2 hours, right? And I said, hey, man, I've got something for you. And I just handed him the book. And I said, I just got a copy of this book yesterday. I wrote it with my wife. And I think you might really enjoy it. And he looked at it and said, wow, that's so cool, man. I love reading books. In fact, this weekend, I was going to go to Half Price Bookstore to load up on books. So this will, be at the top of my list, And I don't know if he read it. I don't know if he's consumed it or not, but I'm hoping that he did.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a unique opportunity. I've got some other friends of mine that they have little care packages for their Amazon delivery drivers, UPS delivery.
Nice.
And it's this cardboard box that sits right by their door and it says, hey, attention, Amazon, UPS, FedEx, whatever, take anything you want. And it's like little goodie bags of
nice.
Candy or whatever, but there's also gospel tracts placed inside. Brilliant. And so I could easily see them, and they don't even know I have a book yet, but I could easily see them saying, oh, wow, we'll just, take a book with you. It's an adventure novel, which the book reads like a novel. It's not like a heavy academic tome. These are stories, just like the compelled stories. They're engaging, they grab you. These are written first person narrative, actually. So it's a super fast read and super engaging.
I would encourage people to think of others that they might do that with. And I don't care about the money. If you can't afford it or you don't want to pay for it, email me, jonathan@10ofthose.com. Tell me how many copies you want. If you honestly can't afford it, that's fine. We'll send them to you for free. But think how you might use this as a little tool to have some more conversation, to continue the conversation, or maybe to close the conversation, but point people to Jesus. JONATHAN at 10ofthose.com.
Jonathan at 10ofthose.com.
And we genuinely mean this. This isn't like some sort of PR stunt or whatever. Tell us what you can afford. If you can't afford anything, tell us how many you want. And we'll probably just ask you to pay the shipping just so that that's covered. But otherwise, the passion is to get this out in a big way.
Absolutely. Now, for those who can afford, where do they buy copies?
10ofthose.com is the lowest price that you can get. We only charge $1 shipping no matter how many you buy, whether it's 1 or 1,000. So I think if you're going to buy one, it's like $12. That's mainly because USPS shipping type thing. But it drops down to, I think, $2, $2.49, something like that when you buy 100, which actually, when you think of the 10 friends here and 5 friends there, the people at the golf club, you're going to get through those very, very quickly. And we'd encourage you to do that and to spread the word about it. If you've got a house group or whatever, why not as a house group, see if each person in your house group could give away 10 copies. There's 100 gone right there. And as you've said, this isn't to pay for your house move or anything else like that. It is to help introduce people to Jesus. And there are loads of creative ways we can do it. Whether it's taking a plate of cookies round to your neighbors and saying, hey, I know it's not Christmas, but I'm early and I've got you a present. And amazing what opportunities you have if you go with that smile on your face to be able to do it. So 10ofthose.com, you can get it and it's only $1 shipping.
Jonathan Carswell, thank you so much for just sharing your story. Also, I'm so glad that we can partner together in making this book available to the world. but we're really these stories that what God has done in written form now.
Yeah, pleasure, privilege to partner with you. Thank you.
And there you have it, the story behind the stories. We've received some great reviews from our early readers, including Lee Strobel, Marvin Olasky, Ginger Hubbard, and others. And I assure you that if you have been blessed and encouraged by the testimonies you've heard on Compelled about the great God we serve, then anyone you give this book to who reads these testimonies can be blessed as well. Compelled is available right now, this moment, anywhere good books are found. But if you go to the 10 of Those website, I guarantee you're going to find the cheapest price. And there's two reasons for that. First, you can buy one and get one free when you use the promo code COMPELLED. But pay attention, you have to add 2 copies of the Compelled book to your cart. After you enter the promo code COMPELLED, then you'll see the discount. But again, to get that discount, you need to use the promo code before the end of July. The other reason why 10 of Those will have the cheapest price is if you buy a case of 100 copies, then you can get each book for $2.49 each. I just heard last week from a listener in Calgary, Alberta, who's buying 100 to put in little free libraries all across her city as she goes on walks. And we heard from a group of pastors in England who bought 100 copies to split across their 3 congregations for summer reading. If you'd like either of those discounts, just head over to 10ofthose.com and search for Compelled. Today's episode was edited by Will Jackson, mixing and mastering by Sonomorphic, and our associate producer is my delightful wife, Sarah Hastings. I'm your host, Paul Hastings, and you've been listening to Compelled. We'll be back next time with another compelling story. We'll see you then.